we'll all just go sit down and they'll just give us a lecture on the history
Yeah,
of the
I would
room,
love that.
right?
I would love that too.
We don't need to talk about disinformation, it's fine.
It's fine, it's going to regulate itself. That's what it is.
Yeah, wasn't the answer self-regulation?
Yeah,
That's
it
what I thought
always,
we
it
both
always.
believe. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Congratulations for spending a bit of your time on this panel on disinformation today. This is an especially relevant topic now, given the geopolitical context, the Ukrainian war, the economic hardship connected to that, the loss of trust in media and
Just rewind. No, just let me say a few words to present this panel. First of all, apologies for this delay, which was beyond our control. We couldn't do anything to avoid you waiting. I am Paolo Cesarini. I will be your moderator. I am a member of the management board of the European Media and Information Fund, who hosts this session today, and which is, for those who are not familiar with, is a philanthropic fund that finances research, fact-checking, investigations, and media literacy initiatives to counter disinformation. So the panel today will look at disinformation as a main, but not only, threat of our online information environment. And we'll look at, in particular, the evolving regulatory framework, which has brought the major online platform at the core of an intense debate with an attempt to make them more accountable, more transparent, and with the hope to create a more intelligible information ecosystem in Europe. Let me say from the outset, and picking up from the panel we had, the interesting panel we had this morning on foreign interference, that when we talk about disinformation, we talk about a phenomenon that had different facets. There is the aspect that we have been discussing at the panel this morning, where it is clear-cut, the threat is clear-cut. When manipulation of information comes within the framework of a hybrid war, it is clear that we have an adversarial scenario that needs to be tackled. But disinformation has also different, it presents itself under different lights and different shapes and forms. It can be influence operations that are grown domestically or concern issues that are not directly influenced by foreign powers, but by the internal political debate, which the new technology may help in distorting in terms of reach, speed of certain messages to the detriment of other voices that are not equally able to control the space as other malicious actors. So, having said that, I would like to also remind you that there are different dimensions also in the responses to disinformation. Research is very important, and the EY is hosting the whole event today, and also hosting the EDMO, the European Digital Media Observatory, that stimulate and foster research around disinformation as one of the key elements to counter this phenomenon. But media literacy and societal resilience through awareness are also equally important. All this happens not in a vacuum, but happens in a regulatory framework that is fast evolving. The last year has seen the adoption of the Digital Services Act, a new revamped code of practice against disinformation, other initiatives like the Artificial Intelligence Act, and most recently the proposal for a Media Freedom Act. All these have different implications, right, for the theme that we are debating today, and to try to disentangle the different aspects of this complex network of rules and regulations that have put the platforms at the center stage of a transformation that needs to be brought forward in the interest of democracy and of citizens. We have today a panel of distinguished speakers I will start, I will follow the order. With, Luca Bertuzzi is a reporter from Euroactive. He leads the teams of journalists in Paris, Berlin, and of course, Brussels, and is a specialist in new affairs and digital policies. Ľuboš, Kukliš, apart from being an old friend, he is now part of the team that deals with the enforcement of the Digital Service Act. He has a long experience in the media regulatory field. He has been chair of the ERGA, so the group of media regulators in Europe. Then we have Alex Engler, who is a fellow at Brookings Institution and also has other assignments in the academic world. He's especially in AI and governance of new technologies. And last but not least, Sandra Wachter. I hope that my pronunciation is not too offensive. Who is professor at the Internet Institute, Oxford Internet Institute at the Oxford University. He also collaborates with other renowned academic institutions, and also advisor for governments. And your field of expertise is technologies, basically AI, big data, robotics, and seen under the angle both legal and ethical, right? So, without further ado, I would leave now, please, the floor to this introductory speech by Madeleine de Buning, who is the chair of the advisory board of the European Digital Media Observatory, who couldn't be present today, but she will be so kind to send us a video with a few words of introduction.
Congratulations for spending a bit of your time on this panel on disinformation today. This is an especially relevant topic now, given the geopolitical context, the Ukrainian war, the economic hardship connected to that, the loss of trust in media and institutions, and therefore I think it's really important to think about how we can solve for disinformation. My name is Madeleine de Buning. I'm the chair of the Advisory Council of EDMO, the European Digital Media Observatory, and I'm going to talk about the relationship between EMIF and EDMO, because both are working together to make sure that we're getting it right on societal resilience for disinformation. EMIF and EDMO, that's a very exciting combination. EDMO will set the research agenda based on the academic work of the EDMO board, and then EMIF will do the funding. It has 25 million euros to do that, and it divides its works between the working stream fact-checking, investigations, media literacy, and multidisciplinary research. Last year alone, it has worked on 40 projects over 23 countries. So that's super exciting. Now let me tell you a little bit about EDMO. EDMO Europe, together with the EDMO hubs throughout Europe, work on the building of societal resilience against disinformation and empower academic research to make sure that we have the right access to the disinformation phenomena that takes place at the platforms. We have repositories for fact-checkers, for media and information literacy, and also an academic repository. And the thing that's also very important for us as EDMO is that we provide or help provide access for academics to do research on how the platforms are dealing with disinformation. So this is all what we're doing as EDMO and EMIF. And I would like to invite you for the upcoming discussion to make sure to also start thinking about the European elections ahead, because those elections are going to be very important. So I was wondering, could the panel talk a little bit about the disinformation that is expected around those European elections and what we as EDMO and EMIF can do best to make sure that we build resilience against disinformation challenges around those elections. Because people need to know what to vote on fair premises. They need to be able to get the right information for them to take their decisions. And they want to do that using different sources to make sure that they make the choice that they actually intend to make. Thank you very much. Enjoy the panel.
Okay, very good. So, rightly, Madeleine rightly remembers us that the challenges surrounding this information and the regulatory framework that should mitigate the risks created by the online digital environment nowadays needs to be tackled with quite a sense of urgency because the elections are fast approaching. After summer, basically, we will start to enter into a campaign mode, right? So I would like to start with Ľuboš, perhaps, asking you where we stand with the implementation of the DSA, its connection with the code of practice. Are we ready to face these new challenges? What are, in your view, the most important aspects that we need to keep in mind of these new frameworks, where we lag behind eventually? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's always great to be in Florence and in these premises. Well, where we stand, we have DSA, which is in place since November 2022. Now we're in a phase where everybody's preparing for it. It's not enforced with the players as of yet. The biggest ones will need to implement a DSA from late August, let's say, because of the designations. Now, a few days ago, the major players who have been designated as very large online platforms and very large online search engines, and these are those that the DSA will impact the most, because what the new thing about DSA in this environment is that every of these major players will need to assess the risks within their own services. And part of those risks is risk of disinformation. It is not called disinformation in DSA. It is a negative effect on civic discourse, how it is phrased within the DSA. But yes, this is about the problem of disinformation and specifically manipulation of the services by nefarious actors, let's say. Now, the code of practice on disinformation is something that's been here for a while. It's been enacted 2018/2019. It was prepared just before the last European elections. So I think it's maybe now is a good time to assess where we are with the code of practice. Now, the code of practice started as a self-regulatory instrument. It was written by and prepared by the platforms themselves. We have to admit that they were nudged a bit by the European Commission at the time. They were asked to do that, but yes, they sat around the table and written the code. Now, there was a first phase after the European elections of assessment, what we achieved by that code. Now, the problem was that if it's something is self-regulatory, okay, you can ask platforms to do something, but you can assess what they've done, but you can't punish them if they didn't fulfill their commitments, right? So even at that time, we started to talk about, can we have some kind of co-regulatory structure? So we can let them to write the commitments, to fulfill the commitments, but then you can have some kind of redress if something is not working as to the potential, let's say. And it was at the same time where DSA, the legislative process of the DSA started. So there was the question how to connect those. And now, yes, the system now works, or is supposed to work this way, that we have a hard legislation, which is the DSA. You are asking the platforms to assess the risks, for example, for disinformation. And when it's not when the risks are not assessed right, or you have to assess your own risk, and then you have to have a proposal how to mitigate them. Now, both the risks may be identified badly, so you can ask them to do it again, rightly, or there may be the mitigations are not enough, so we can again ask them to make better the mitigation of those. And if those things are not in place, then you can actually follow by a real sanction, by fine. Now, the process is a lengthy one. We don't have time to go through it, so you can't expect, like, for example, in the old world with the media, where media were responsible for every item of content, for example, in broadcast. So if something illegal was broadcasted, you punish them like a month after that. No, this process is longer. But it makes sense, because we are talking about extremely sensitive topics. We are talking about freedom of speech, of course. As Lutz rightly pointed out this morning, to lie is not illegal. So we have to, we are thinking about systemic kind of risks within that. One lie is not a problem. The manipulation of the system and the systemic approach, the systemic impact of these things is a problem. And this is what the DSA is trying to capture. Now, the DSA is now being rolled out, but it's a horizontal regulation. It demands to be supplemented by other legislation that will be sector specific. Now, for disinformation, we have nothing there as of yet, and probably won't be there for quite some time. But we also have in the works now European Media Freedom Act, and there's a kind of overlap. Now, you have Article 17 within the proposed regulation on the European Media Freedom Act, which requires the platforms to treat media content a bit differently than other content. It is there to protect media, and the proposal is, I think, quite sensible on this topic. They have to have a special treatment, but it's not that, for example, you can't content moderate the media content. You just have to have better explanation for media when the content is treated somehow within the content moderation. And you give them a prior notice if you're going to take down, for example, that content. Now, within the European Parliament, there are now some amendments being worked out, and some of those, or especially one coming from Cult Committee, is trying to establish a right to stay up. We call it a stay up provision, which would mean that even if there's, for example, there's a media, now I wouldn't go to how to distinguish which content is from media, which not. But if you have a media content that might be a disinformation, and normally the platform would use their own rules to take down, for example, the content because it is disinformation, now it has to stay up for 24 or even 48 hours. The media would need to have a kind of recourse right, they can make a back and forth whether it is or it's not disinformation, and only after that it can be taken down. Now, we all know probably in the room that, for a disinformation to stay up 24 hours, you don't need to handle it afterwards, it's already done all the damage it could. So, and this is the thing where we are now working out the DSA, we are trying to implement it, it's not even there yet. And here you have a proposal that might kind of drill a hole into the whole system, because my experience is quite a lot about Eastern Europe, for example. All the major peddlers of disinformation are thinking about themselves as media. They have their own organizations, they are, associating themselves. So there's this quite big danger. So I wanted to just spell it out that we may have system, we want to try it, we want to, make it really work. And then at the same time, we might have creating a hole within the whole system.
Indeed, it's work in progress, and we'll see how the parliamentary debate will progress. For the moment, we are seeing worrying signals, indeed, I agree with you. But just a quick, flashy follow-up question. Shall we see very soon or later the code of practice being recognized as a code of conduct within the meaning of the DSA?
That's the idea. There's the co-regulatory structure within the DSA is working through the system of codes of conduct. So within the code of practice, it's been already written with the idea, because there's a second version. I probably forgot to mention that there's a second version which is aiming really to connect in the end with the DSA. And yes, it needs to be recognized as a code of conduct. Yes, the work already started on that. Now for that, of course, you need to work that out with the signatories of the code. That's one thing. But for it to be truly there, you also need the agreement of the Board of Digital Services Coordinators, which is the body that would, digital service coordinators are the regulatory authorities within the DSA.
Which will meet for the first time?
And it will meet in the first time in February 2024. So
before
until
the
then,
elections.
That's it.
Thank you, Ľuboš. I will pass now the floor to Sandra. And you see, Sandra, Ľuboš has already touched upon this interference, I would say, between different legislations and risk. I mean, the difficulty to have a coherent approach. I would add a new dimension for you to address, is the dimension of the evolving technologies and need to ensure that the regulation remains not only consistent, but also future-proof. And the AI, we know it's an expanding domain where technologies that moving very, very fast, faster than legislation for sure. So I would like to have your sense about the threats that come from technological developments and how that impact on the information system, in particular how they can help or hamper the fight against disinformation.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question that I don't think I have a perfect solution or answer to, but I am happy to give it a couple of thoughts. I think everybody in the room will be aware that, general purpose AI has met the headlines for months now. It's in the media cycle, it's being hyped, it's everywhere. And so I think I would just like to offer a couple of reflections how I think that particular technology will impact freedom of speech and the media ecosystem in general. And I think there are three, at least in my head, there are three different ways of how that could potentially happen. So if, general purpose AI, large language models, for example, are being embedded by platforms themselves, what that means. The second thing has to do with what happens if a user, a citizen, is using that particular technology to create content. And the third one has to do with what if a journalist is, for example, using the technology. And so that has different implications regardless, depending on where you look at. So the first one is, what if a platform is using general purpose AI? And I think that's an interesting thing to think about because it's highly likely that those systems are going to be embedded more and more by platforms. We see this, that language models are supposed to find their way into search engines, for example, right? And so what does that mean for journalistic practice if search engines are being used for research? What does it mean for academia in that sense, for anybody who is seeking truth, being confronted with a tool that hallucinates and talks nonsense, right? So that poses a really big problem here in terms of, who can we trust? Interestingly enough, it also poses the question of liability, linking that back to the DSA. Most of you will know DSA in general has a privilege in the sense that platforms are not supposed to be held liable for the content that is on their platform as long as they can be seen as a neutral infrastructure provider. Right? As soon as they know that something problematic is happening, illegal content, they have to take action, but they don't really have to be proactive there. But they only get that privilege as long as they're the neutral provider of the infrastructure, as long as they're not meddling with the things. But now if you embed a large language model into a search engine, is that still neutral, actually, right? Can you really say that's the same as hosting content on a media platform? Or is it more active? And if it's more active, it would mean that the privileges of non-liability wouldn't actually apply, and all the speech regulation might actually kick in, which can be good, could be bad. It's fragmented across member states, so it's not really clear how effective it is. But it's interesting that a framework that was supposed to free you from liability could make you liable if you're using that particular technology, if you agree that it's not purely neutral and hosting content in a sense. So this general purpose AI being used by platforms. The second one is, what does it mean for misinformation and freedom of expression in media if a user, like an end user, is using that type of technology? And so I think everybody will know that generative AI can be used to create very, very convincing images, videos, audio, in a way that is really, really hard to detect for everybody, from the layperson to the experts to academics to everybody. And so, most of you will remember that, that deep fake of the Pope wearing that white jacket. It was really, really well done. It was really, really well done, right? And if you look at it quickly, like, that could be real. And that's just, a funny kind of example, but like the same technology can also create something that is fake, that is not just funny. It could actually just lead to a lot of misinformation, increasing panic, if it's being used for interference in any way. And so that poses then the question, how do we deal with that? It's going to be hard for platforms to understand what's real or not, but it's also going to be very hard for journalists to understand what's real or not. And so both can actually then amplify that content and make the whole thing more problematic. And we already talked about the issues of content regulation. And again, it reminds me a little bit of the discussion that we had when the right to be forgotten first came around, right? Because it's a similar situation where like Google was asked to de-index information that was seen as too privacy invasive. And the whole question was like, but should companies really have the last say of what's in the public interest and what is worth preserving in terms of privacy? And we have a similar discussion now here again, just on steroids, right? Because you're trying to figure out what is newsworthy, important information that is important for the democratic process, for election, but the last arbitrator is still a platform in the end. So it's just reminiscent of that power struggle, because on the one hand, you want something to be done, but you don't trust the people who are supposed to do something about it. So you kind of like in a deadlock in that situation. And again, I can't offer a solution here, but it's just something that we have to grapple with, that the people who are making the decisions, what's newsworthy, is not necessarily an elected member by the general public. And the last one has to do with if large language models are being used by journalists. And that is just, really impressive what, for example, ChatGPT can do in terms of like offering a first draft of something, right? Which is being used a lot, what I hear by journalists. And again, I can see that there's a really big temptation to use it for any type of writing-related task. Again, I'm an academic, so a lot of students are very excited about this, to use it for essays. Some academics are very excited to use it for marking, for example. So in a way that everybody who has some type of writing task will want to embed that in their practices. And coming back to journalism, we know that, journalism and media companies are in a situation where funding is constantly being cut. And so there are a lot of pressure to produce content, often that is sensational, that rises clicks, that increases ad revenue. So a tool that helps you to produce something really fast is really tempting in that ecosystem. And again, but if you're using it very quickly, you might just be a player in the whole misinformation situation, because it's like just lying sometimes. And so we really need to think about like the ecosystem that journalism lives in, that because you can't create a technology that helps you cutting cost and time, but at the same time reducing funding, pushing people in that direction, and be angry at them that they're migrating towards that. So it's really important to think about sustainable business models with independent funding being put into the media sector to make sure that you're not being drawn in that direction. And I know that some of the proposals already talk about that in sustainability and funding, but this technology really shows us that we really need to think about this in more detail. In terms of solutions, I think it's going to be super, super important that we invite independent researchers in. And I know the DSA and the Code of Practice already have some indications that this should happen. How this will play out in practice, we will see. But I think it's really, really important to have independent researchers that are not on the payroll of tech companies to tell us how effective the mitigation strategies are, that tell us more about the toxicity of the content, tell us more about the impact of misinformation, so we can make informed policy decisions based on that. So I really think it's a good framework, but we really need to make sure that we get more evidence in terms of future steps forward. The last thing I just want to say around the AI Act, there's not much to say yet because we don't really know how it will impact generative AI. There could be multiple scenarios. We could end up in a situation where there's no regulation at all. I don't think that's going to happen. What we already know is that if a large language model or generative AI is used in a high-risk sector, then the high-risk sector regulations will apply. That's undisputed. But there is now discussion on whether or not generative AI in itself, by itself, as a technology should be regulated as well, independent of where it's going to be embedded. And there's a lot of back and forth, and people have very mixed feelings around that, but we don't know. So we could end up in a situation where it's either seen as its own risk category and put in Annex 3 in the same way that employment is a high-risk category or criminal justice is a high-risk category, could end up there, and we can talk about if that's a good idea, or that just some of the high-risk elements actually do apply with it. And so some of the ideas in terms of regulation, and again, we don't know, and I don't want to be like a crystal ball person here, but some of the ideas are that it's only going to be seen as a high-risk category, or it's not going to be seen as a high-risk category if there is some human review. And that links back to media organization. So it could be if a person actually looks at it and says, this is sound, then it's not going to be seen as a high-risk category. And that, coming back to the whole problem of, can we really know what's synthetic content and what is artificial content? And that's just something to keep in mind. And the last thing that I want to say is, again, here in terms of solutions, what I hope, and again, I don't know what will happen with the AI, but what I hope is that some elements of generative AI will be regulated independent of where it's being deployed, because there are some things that will always be problematic. Doesn't matter if it's a high-risk system or a low-risk system, because you're always going to have problems with privacy. The thing is trained on data, it can leak data, you can attack it, you can find personal information about people, so it doesn't really matter in what system it's being embedded, the privacy risk will be there. There's always going to be a bias problem. There is no perfect data, there is no unbiased data, so bias is always going to be an issue. We don't know how those things actually fully work. Explainability is always going to be an issue, and the environmental impact of that system and the work conditions of the people, the ghost worker behind the data, is always going to be an issue. So thinking about good standards for generative models, independent of where they're going to be deployed, is something that is on my wish list. I hope something like that will develop, but we don't know. So yeah, a lot of problems, but we'll see in a couple of weeks how it turns out.
Thanks a lot, Sandra. I'm conscious of the time. We started late, and some speakers, actually, Luca has a flight to catch, so I'm obliged to speed up a little bit. But indeed, I mean, now, building up on what Sandra was saying, the generative AI has been dealt with in scientific publications in a way or another. Nature has issued new editorial guidelines, and ChatGPT cannot be credited as an author. Or Science has really banned the use of ChatGPT for publications on science. But we have no safeguards in the journalistic world, in the information world at large so far. So the question is, and that I would like you, Alex, to try to help us with, what is the impact of this information actually on audiences, particularly in view of this potential incremental amplification of narratives that can be the result of very sophisticated AI systems that increase the reach, increase the speed also of creation? What is your experience about impact of?
Yeah, I think that again is not something, that's not an answer I can give by just thinking about it. I think that's something that research really needs to underpin. Just coming back to the very boring thing, we really need researchers to tell us about the impact of it. There is a lot of, again, hype in terms of like harm that could come with it, interference with governments, addiction of social media, impact on psychological health and things like that. And so if those concerns are real and those are really important issues, then we really need researchers that know about the area, that are, familiar with psychology, that are familiar with political science, that have the data skills and the theory skills, that's really important, social science skills, to understand what's actually going on. So again, in a situation where API access is being restricted left, right, and center, what really needs to happen is that we have those vetted researchers that could come in and actually measure the potential harm so we can make informed policy making.
Alex, you have been looking at, actually, but looking backwards, not now into the future, but looking backwards. You have been looking a bit what impact past experience of disinformation campaigns, particularly those driven, that proliferated, let's say, during the 2016 presidential elections in US. And there are new findings, new insights about the real impact on public opinion.
Absolutely. So first, thanks to the European Information and Media Fund for having me, and also EUI for hosting. I think it's hard to understand how important independent researcher data access, which is actually like how you say independent researcher data access, what a nerdy, obtuse policy intervention. It is so incredibly important and central to all of this. And I want to describe the American environment, which does not have it, and why that's a problem. If you go back to 2016 with me, very somewhat famously, the Russian Internet Research Agency carried out a computational propaganda and influence efforts over the 2016 US elections. And we saw numbers not that long afterwards that were quite dire. Things like 100 million Americans saw disinformation from that effort, or 3 million followers of Russian accounts on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and sites like that. And when you look at numbers like that, hundreds of millions of engagement with the content that created, it's very, very easy to assume that that is a huge problem. How could you not? 7 years later, we have really rigorous research about that period of time, and it turns out that the overwhelming majority of those interactions were with about 1% of the population. So about 70% of all interactions came from about 1% of users. So it's very, very isolated to the pure number of people who really saw more than like a little bit of the content. It was really washed out by American media and American content, as in it was a very small percentage of the total amount of media seen, and they could find no relationship to voting or outcome behaviors. Now, I don't say this to exonerate Russia, and I think I remind you all that the hack and leak of Hillary Clinton's emails was in the month before the election was probably very influential, and that was a different thing. But was the propaganda effort itself that influential? It is not clear. Another example that we can learn a little bit more about research, in the lead up to the 2020 elections, social media companies actually were very, very engaged. They put many more interventions on reducing disinformation, especially around health, and also in the prior years, also around COVID. And so health misinformation, election information. Now, those were quite good, and the social media companies really kind of thought they'd been successful in the run-up to 2020. And then they walked those interventions back in the ensuing months. And of course, what happens, you have proliferation of election disinformation groups leading up to the January 6th attack on the Capitol, which social media certainly played a role in, though it's not the only factor. All of this is to say, it is really useful to know what your problems are faster than years in retrospect without actual access to underlying data. It is useful to have consistency in the numbers and information you're getting from social media companies, so you can appropriately direct what you're mad at and what you want them to change. In the US, we have what I sometimes call an outrage cycle, which is something bad happens or something that appears bad. We get mad at it, the social media companies react to it, we forget about it, they stop working on it, and we get mad at something else, and nothing really gets systemically better. And I honestly think the DSA is a really meaningful intervention posed at essentially that problem. So we just heard about the DSA. I was going to say a few things I liked about it, but I'll just note that the fact that it is tied to the Code of Practice and Disinformation is very, very meaningful. That could change it towards something that Ľuboš mentioned, something closer to a systemic duty of care, which really says you're not responsible for every bit of disinformation, but you have to try. And you have to try pretty hard, or it is backed by law and fines. I'd also mention that implementation is going to be a big challenge, and it's an interesting time for that because, as Sandra just mentioned, we're seeing less data access, things like CrowdTangle being deactivated, Twitter restricting access to its historical data, and also social media companies actually going through the tech recession we're seeing, firing a lot of the teams that prevent some of this stuff. You'd think of phrases like platform integrity teams or trust and safety teams. Actually, one little silver lining here, this is a good opportunity to hire some of those people. I'm completely serious. It is so hard to understand large social media companies from the outside. Their databases are enormously, intensely complicated. There's a new European Center for Algorithmic Transparency. Might actually be worth poaching some of these people. I know they've got to staff up. But broadly, implementation challenges, but I'm excited to see it. Briefly on generative AI, Sandra did a great job talking about it. I do think it belongs in a content discussion. I do think it belongs in more of a systemic duty of care discussion often when you're talking about creating information. Not that everything it does needs to be truthful, but broadly you want it to be. And so really that maybe means it's a DSA conversation, that it should be part of the Digital Services Act. Now I have no idea if they're implementing acts that could do that, but again, I'll give it to Ľuboš and remind you that I'm an American and sometimes I just don't know that much. The US did actually just release yesterday 2 big interventions on generative AI. One, a commitment from some of the big companies, Microsoft, OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, NVIDIA, I think I'm missing a few, to release some of their models to a big sort of hacking conference called DEF CON. They'll be red teamed and analyzed. And I think that's actually a pretty impressive accomplishment on a voluntary basis and will hopefully get at some of the transparency and sort of a sense of their toxicity and discrimination. It will not a permanent solution, but a useful short-term step. And so I think hopefully we're excited about that. And I want to also mention One last piece on collaboration. The US, unfortunately, is unlikely to pass platform governance. Our data privacy law failed in late 2022 due to internal debates, an issue preempting the California state law, so we didn't get federal data privacy. Platform governance is harder. It is less likely than privacy. It's less likely than something like the AI Act, partially because speech issues and very polarized conversations about speech, partially because of recent executive overreach by a recent presidential administration. So there's a lot more nervousness about expanding executive powers in ways that could affect speech and media, and which you could argue that something like the DSA would. That being said, the US is going to benefit a lot from the DSA. I would say we're going to benefit from understanding recommender systems and content moderation algorithms better. We're going to benefit from the independent researcher access, and there's room for collaboration there. There's room to invite in American researchers to independent data access. There's room through the Trade and Technology Council to work on a shared understanding of recommenders on content moderation. And I'd encourage you to, I just talking to Ľuboš now, I guess, encourage all of you to find ways to engage with the US on the issues too.
Excellent. I know that you are on a burning seat and you need to go. Luca, can you tell us a little bit, from the point of view of a journalist, to fight disinformation, we can put in place a lot of safeguards, regulate platforms is one of them, but at the end of the day, we need a strong media, a vibrant news media sector that is able to survive and to be sustainable and to adapt to the digital transformation. So the Media Act, in part, Media Freedom Act, sorry, in part try to address that challenge, but what is your view about it?
Thank you very much, and thank you for hosting such a powerful panel at this stage. Let me just start reacting about what was said before about AI and journalism. So it really goes down to what you see as journalists. Some of my colleagues see it as sitting behind a desk, taking a press release and writing a story about that. I strongly disagree. I think journalism is about breaking stories, having sources, and I don't think ChatGPT is anywhere near going to speak to a commission source to get the latest or to get the latest council conclusions. I think ChatGPT will be able to automate some of the processes, the most boring processes like analyzing a very lengthy policy document. That might shorten and make the process more efficient. At the same time, I do agree that hallucinations are the most dangerous aspect of this technology because it really blurs the border on what is real and what is not. Then you have all the other problems that were mentioned before about scale, impersonation, and so on. But we need to go down also to the news cycle to understand how certain things get amplified and picked up. There was a very interesting book from Ryan Holiday called Trust Me, I'm Lying, and it shows how one little thing gets picked up by a minor media outlet, some more media outlets pick it up, and then mainstream media pick it up, and it becomes a snowball. And no one really knows where it came from. It lost all origin on the source. And I really think that that's our responsibility to always know where things are coming from. And this also goes down to some business models of journalism that we are seeing now running on clickbait journalism that certainly amplifies these bad practices, I would say. So going to the regulatory framework, I appreciate the Commission's approach of starting first with a voluntary agreement on this, with the Code of Practice on disinformation, bringing together, perhaps for the first time, platforms and fact-checkers. So of course, platforms are private businesses, they have their commercial interests, but I'll never forget when a Commission official told me, well, also fact-checkers, they sometimes have vested interests. Sometimes when they criticize a platform is because they want to be financed by that platform and they're not receiving enough funding. And the fact of being in the same room really brings clarity about what is going on behind the scenes. But I would also say that this was a very sort of comfortable position for the Commission to be in. And now with the Digital Services Act, it will have to have a much more active role. It will be the first time for the Commission to be a regulator for the European internal market. And the expectations are really high, obviously, and not only in Europe. At Euractiv, we reported the first draft conclusion for the next TTC meeting, and there the code of practice and the DSA are mentioned as sort of international standards. And I know that there is a lot of expectations, as Alex also mentioned, from the other side of the pond to see what will be the effects in terms of transparency for the research community to get to understand this platform better. And I think a lot of these will go down at how decisive the Commission will want to be and how it will work together with national authorities as well. And that's a very underestimated aspect of the DSA, I think. When you give national governments the power to appoint a regulator that will touch on content moderation, well, on certain European countries, there might be problems, and it will be very interesting to see how things will play out in Hungary, for example. And this also goes down to the media exemption that was mentioned before. After all, that implies that you need to draw a line on what is a media and what is not a media. And I think we have already seen that with the sanctions against Russia today, for example. Now, the Commission will say that was not a ban. In practice, it was economic sanctions that resulted in a ban. We have seen Russia today going bankrupt in France, for example. I see some people disagreeing with me. But where does it stop when, a political institution decides this is not a media, this is, a propaganda asset from the Kremlin? And I think that we'll see a lot of that discussion if this media exemption gets real. Who decides who's a independent media and who's not? That is a very dangerous conversation to have, and of course everyone is in favor of media freedom until they are under media scrutiny. And if we see, for example, the draft proposal of the European Media Freedom Act, the Commission pitched itself to be the secretariat of what should be an independent board of regulators, and it's not clear how it can be independent if the secretariat is provided by a political institution. I know there are, of course, administrative and budgetary reasons for that, but still, if we renounce to independence of a regulator for budgetary reasons, that's perhaps we should reconsider our priorities. I'll stop to that for now.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting. Annie,
Yes,
you can help me to perhaps open the debate.
Yeah, I'll introduce myself first.
Yes, sure.
Are you left-handed?
Yep.
Okay, so my name is Annie. I'm an investigative journalist from Armenia. I'm a policy leader fellow here at EY. And I'm co-moderating the panel today. And I just want to touch a little bit different angle. When speaking about regulations, EU regulations, it doesn't only, it goes beyond the member states, the 27 member states. It goes beyond to those countries who align with EU principles, democratic principles. For example, Eastern Partnership countries. I work with the Eastern Partnership countries fact checkers as part of my research here at EY. Moldova, Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan. And I am from one of these countries, and as an investigative journalist, decentralized, less regulated internet helps me, is in favor of verification, finding sources, and also disseminating not only bad disinformation, but also good journalism. You find sources from registries, companies' registries, etc. My question, I will give the question and then open the Q&A session. I hope it's not me. For the audience, and we will take maybe 1-2 questions. Okay, so my question is how we make sure that centralizing, telco-driven, regulation-driven internet is not undermining the freedom of speech, investigative journalism, activism in these countries that are emerging democracies, and sometimes also democratic countries. Thank you, and yeah.
Who wants to pick this one? That's
or we can...
It's a complicated question.
If we have more questions from the audience, we can take a couple of questions, and then our panelists will have time to think about these complicated questions.
You can hear me? Okay. I'm Katarina. Oh, yes, of course. Sorry. Yes, I'm Katarina. I'm a student here at EUI, the School of Transnational Governance. And I wanted to touch upon something that a couple of you actually mentioned in passing. And of course, disinformation is a transnational issue. And especially now with the power of AI and automatic translation, the language barriers are getting even more eroded. So when we're talking about the Code of Practice and the Digital Service Act as this EU thing that also has a little bit of influence for Eastern Partnership countries, but that for America, for example, is not probably going to happen. Does it really have a potential to be an international standard? Does it have a potential to set this kind of bar for other countries? And should we have some kind of, and can we have a sort of transnational, supranational answer to disinformation, given its scope?
One more question. We need more time.
One question would be, if we couldn't go the way that normally is gone in the internet, it's having an app that's able to recognize a ChatGPT thing. Because I heard about that this is already worked on. Do you know any news of it, if it's efficient or not, or something like that? Because this would be of big help, at least for this AI problem within.
Three good questions. Perhaps we have time. If you are fast in answering, we can have perhaps another round of questions afterwards. We have 5 minutes left.
I start with the last one, with the detecting mechanisms. Yes, there's work being done to try to be able to detect whether something is authentic or artificially created content. And so there are a couple of things that you can do. So the discussions on whether we should have like watermarks so you can recognize whether something is artificially created or not. But obviously, as that evolves, there will be smart people that will be able to remove that thing again, right? And then you will have very smart people that will come up with detection methods that are better than this. But then again, very smart people will put it on their on its head. So like in general, if somebody tells you your system cannot be gamed, you're being fooled, right? There will always be somebody that will be able to reverse engineer something. But this is not to say that we shouldn't try, right? It's a cat and mouse game in the same way that it is with cybersecurity. There is no system that is unhackable. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to protect it, and the same thing has to happen here. We just have to keep up with technology and keep evolving and trying to, evolve with that. But yeah, it will be an ongoing back and forth, I'm afraid, with all fakeness. We have never been able to eradicate fakeness in any meaningful way.
Just to add on, I think that's totally right. There's something called the Swiss cheese model in this space, and it's that every defense you have has holes in it, but if you have lots of pieces of Swiss cheese in a row, one of the cheeses will stop the slices, will stop the attack. So there's other things you do at the same time. You look for automated, the bots that are manipulating, going between websites, right? You look for that. You look for fake imagery, and maybe you can detect that the profile pictures are potentially fake, or you note coordinated material across several websites, or you notice that the text is potentially watermarked or something. And so watermarking alone, I don't expect to be very effective. There will be too many different models, and you can change them too easily in the long run. But among many other interventions, yeah, I think hopefully we can, the balance of disinformation against detection will not have radically shifted because of this, hopefully. And maybe a quick, do you mind a quick thought on the, and then I think you said as well for the coordination. Just one note on coordination. I do think the platform access could be scaled, so the researcher access. So that is something where it will be complicated infrastructure to build, but once it's built, you could bring other countries in. You could expand the available data to do that. So there are some paths to collaboration. I think it's an interesting question, and I really genuinely don't know the answer of what other countries are really going to approach the sort of systemic duty of care around disinformation. Though the UK online safety bill is looking a little bit more like that recently, so maybe it's a good question.
Yeah, I want to jump in on this. What Katerina said, well, the code of practice on disinformation was first, of its kind in the world, and just to showing that something like this is possible is I think something that really breaks new ground. Now we have similar kinds of codes in Australia, in New Zealand, for example. Yes, the online harms bill, it's not a code, it's like similarly, the same thinking as goes into DSA went into UK in the online harms bill. So you are breaking ground now, of course, and this connects to other countries, for example, non-democratic ones. I was a media regulator before that many years, and we've always heard these kind of things when we're talking to people from non-democratic countries or from different regions, like, you are doing something, and then, for example, our governments will take that up and use that against us because it's a regulation. I would say it's similar to, or it's the same thing that happened in Europe. Now, really you can't say that because for DSA to actually work, you need to have a constitutional, framework around that. You need to have independent courts. You need to have free elections. So it's the whole system. You can't take just one provision from any law and say that this is the same thing. It's not. And we know that this might be happening, that there might be some kind of, misuse of something like that. But in democratic countries, it can't be an argument for not trying to make things better. So I think, you just have to always say that, okay, it's not one provision, it's not one law, it's not even a series of law. It's the whole framework, legal framework around that, starting from the constitutional system that, needs to be working out there.
Maybe just to add to this, yes. First, maybe I should start saying I know absolutely nothing on the Eastern Partnership countries. But to your question about the international standard, we are already seeing jurisdiction, as was mentioned, that are picking up on the DSA. Brazil was discussing a bill drawing on the DSA this week. I think, and Canada, Switzerland are also looking at something similar. It will go down at, just like with the GDPR, how effective it will be in practice. I think there is a lot of attention to that and a lot of expectations. But you also touched upon the issue of languages. And I think if there is something that the war in Ukraine showed us in terms of information manipulation is that social media are still not there in terms of content moderation for a lot of languages. Yeah. And it comes down to resources and data points that are, of course, more limited if the population speaking that language is limited. I think because also the European elections were mentioned before, European elections are a big national campaign and with national audiences. And that will be, again, another test bed to see how far we have improved in making this content moderation system more sound.
And if I can add, the new version of the Code of Practice on Disinformation is very strong about, spelling out that it should be data from all the languages in the EU, for example, and all on the member state, because that's one of the really downsides of the first version, that we have all the data aggregated from all of for all of the EU, which meant that all the data came from Germany and France, for example. So now it's really clear there that they need to cater to all languages.
Yeah. I think we have 1 minute left. If there is one burning question, please fire it, and I will ask you to reply like, in a snapshot.
Thank you. My name is Ivan Nenadic. I work as a research fellow at European University Institute, and I also collaborate with on the EDMO project. I will put kind of an elephant in the room, considering that the panel was organized by the European Media Information Fund, and there's been a lot of talk about the need for research to understand complex problems, research to inform policies, research to assess policies. What we know from EDMO repositories, for example, is that in Europe, our research is focused more on US than any other individual European state. I don't know what the reason for this is, but clearly we need more research to understand these complex issues in Europe, but we face a huge problem, which is financing of research. So how do we solve this problem of lack of funds? And perhaps even when there are funds, very often the frameworks are overly bureaucratic. So maybe just a final thought on these things.
Well, that's a comment and also an appeal to everybody to provide further funding to EMIF. But apart from that, I don't know if you want to comment.
I can only fully agree with you. I fully echo what you have said. My adopted country is the UK. So, in terms of funding research, it looks dire at the moment. We lost access to European funds now. As you might have seen, the UK government is not necessarily jumping in order to fill that gap. So again, if you're starting to collect, count me in, please. That'd be great. So yeah, I can fully echo that and fully understand the frustration. We really need to think about how we can have sustainable funds to allow for independent research, but it's a matter of money, unfortunately. It's always a matter of money, and you get what you pay for, right? So if you start to drain everything, then the content and the research and the vigor will go down. And so it's really a question of investment in the future, and independent research, which is really, really important. So I don't have a solution, but if you have one, let me know, because I could use some help as well.
Just two quick thoughts. Making data available will actually bring in research funding. You'll have more data available in Europe, and so that's where the researchers will want to go. You'll be able to do higher quality, more detailed studies and say new things. So actually just being a first mover on data access will kind of change that. And the other side, you also do need to fund it because the researcher access is an enforcement provision. It's how you know the companies are being honest in transparency reports and all the other things. It's how you know the metrics are good choices. So you really do need to care about funding for the research because that's the only way you know you're not getting a really selective look at platform function by the companies. Otherwise, those numbers become very hard to trust. So I do think the process will attract some funding, but it's also really necessary to address that for the enforcement reasons.
I think we have exhausted the time at our disposal. I thank you very much for participating today. A special thanks to these excellent speakers, and enjoy Florence for the rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to meet you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a pleasure. Super interesting.